The year is 1944. The Estonian landscape is paralyzed by a seemingly endless winter. The biting wind from the Baltic Sea blows like blades of ice, tearing at the exposed skin of anyone who dares to face it. Snow, stained with soot and blood, covers fields that months ago were green and fertile. Now every step sinks into frozen mud, and even the sound of gunshots seems muffled by the white blanket of death. German troops of the Army Group North, exhausted by months of relentless battle, drag themselves along like specters. They are men who have lost count of the days. Their boots are torn, their uniforms are soaked and stiff from the cold, and their eyes are empty. They dig trenches around the fortress city of Narva, their hands shaking not only from exhaustion, but from fear. Each shovelful of earth removed is a struggle against the rock-hard ground, frozen by the relentless cold. They know these trenches are the last barrier before the Soviet advance engulfs all of Estonia. Behind them, Estonian citizens live in agonizing silence. Entire families hide in freezing basements, afraid of what's to come. Many have seen what happens when Red Army returns. Deportations, executions, and entire villages disappearing overnight. The trauma of the first Soviet occupation is still fresh in the memory. Stories of neighbors torn from their homes, of children taken in train cars into the unknown, whispered like warnings in the deserted streets. Every breath of wind carries the distant echo of artillery. War is near and everyone knows it. The air is thick with tension, as if nature itself holds its breath before the storm. Narva, now the heart of the defense, has become a symbol of resistance and also a harbinger of the worst yet to come. Each night, the cold kills more soldiers than bullets, and the fear of being overwhelmed by the enemy keeps everyone awake. It's a deathly silence, broken only by the sound of ice breaking on the Narva River and the howling wind carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder. In this icy landscape, where every shadow could be death, the battle for Estonia is about to begin. The Red Menace was already looming on the horizon. The distant sound of Soviet engines echoed like thunder, and each explosion lit up the night sky over Narva. Faced with the inevitable offensive, Hitler ordered the erection of a nearly impossible barrier, the Estonian Wall. The call Estonian Wall, it was not a line of massive concrete fortifications like the Maginot Line in France. It was a makeshift colossus, made from whatever was at hand. Treacherous swamps, dense forests, and the Narva River itself turned into deadly allies. Wehrmacht engineers working in breath-freezing temperatures began to reshape the landscape. Bunkers appeared in the snow, hidden among icy hills. Networks of zigzag trenches snaked through the terrain, connecting machine gun and anti-tank gun positions. Landmines were buried in fields where months before children had played. Every meter of the wall was designed to turn the Soviet advance into a nightmare of steel and blood. There were too few men for so much terrain. To compensate, they used nature itself as a weapon. Swamps that swallowed heavy vehicles, forests that turned into deadly labyrinths, and the icy Narva River like a natural moat that made any crossing difficult. Each night, the sound of pickaxes and shovels competed with the wail of the wind. Soldiers with hands cracked from the cold continued to work, knowing that when the enemy arrived, every meter of trench could mean minutes more of life. But the wall wasn't just made of mud and steel. Many Estonianos, who equally hated Nazi rule and the Soviet return, began to join the German ranks. For them, fighting at the Estonian Wall meant fighting for their own soil, for their families hidden in the villages, for their last chance to prevent the Red Army from bringing back the terror of deportation. As the defensive line took shape, rumors swirled. Among the soldiers, on the other side, Stalin was assembling an overwhelming force, promising to sweep Estonia within weeks. Every German or Estonian soldier who drove a stake into the snow knew that when the attack began, they would face an unstoppable tide of humanity. Still, they dug in, set up barbed wire, and prepared their weapons. It was the last wall between Estonia and hell. The dawn of February 1944 brought no light or hope, only the distant roar of what was to come. The horizon trembled. Under the weight of Leningrad Front, the immense Soviet war machine, more than 200,000 soldiers, supported by hundreds of fences, T-34, heavy artillery batteries and attack aircraft squadrons, were about to launch against the Estonian wall. The first signs of the offensive were felt even before visual contact. The ground began to vibrate, as if a silent earthquake were rippling through the icy hills of Narva. Then came the initial bombardment. Soviet artillery opened fire with almost superhuman fury. The sky darkened with arcing shells, each impact sending up columns of snow, earth and bodies in a macabre spectacle. For hours, the earth shook under a hammer of steel. Soldiers in the German and Estonian trenches cowered, their ears ringing and hearts racing, hoping the next shot wouldn't land directly on them. When the bombing ceased, the silence was more terrifying than the sound of destruction. Then the first silhouettes appeared. Endless rows of Soviet soldiers advancing like a living wall, backed by the roars of their T-34, whose tracks crunched snow and ice. Each tank carried soldiers clinging to its sides, ready to disembark and attack. The air smelled of gunpowder and burnt fuel, mixed with the acrid odor of fear. For the defenders of the Estonian wall, the moment was surreal. Every man knew he was about to face overwhelming numbers, a human tidal wave intent on sweeping everything in its path. German machine guns began to fire, spitting fire into the red waves. The first Soviets fell, the snow stained red with hot blood, but behind them came others, and more unwavering. The red storm had begun, and it would not stop until it consumed Narva completely. The Soviet attack hits the Estonian wall like an avalanche of steel and flesh. The defensive lines tremble under the force of the first shock. The German divisions, supported by 20th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, largely made up of Estonians, open fire mercilessly. MG-42 machine guns roar, their rapid fire cutting through the air and mowing down entire ranks of Soviet soldiers. Each shot leaves trails of smoke in the biting cold, each burst creating momentary gaps in the advancing red mass. The ground is so soaked with blood that the snow around the trenches turns to a crimson paste. The T-34 tanks continue to advance, their turrets rotating, spewing explosive shells that pulverize bunkers and send bodies flying. Each artillery strike rips up the frozen earth, burying alive men who seconds before were firing their weapons. In the chaos, Estonian soldiers fight with almost desperate fury. For many, this is not a fight for Germany. It is a fight for their own survival, for the land of their birth. They know what comes with the Red Army: deportations, labor camps, and families torn apart. Every bullet fired carries the weight of the fear of losing everything. The heaven turns into hell-black smoke, and snow mingle, obscuring the daylight. The screams of the wounded and dying are lost in the incessant roar of battle. Fragments of metal and body parts fall from the explosions, embedding themselves in the hard snow. It is a relentless carnage, where fear and adrenaline replace rational thought. And yet, behind each crashing wave, a new wave of Soviet soldiers emerges from the mist, pushing the defenders to their limit. First wave of the Red Storm has reached the wall, and it's just beginning. In the midst of chaos, the real dilemma arises. Estonianos, many are dressed in German uniforms, wielding weapons they did not choose, but with a purpose that is theirs alone, to protect their own land. They fight alongside the 20th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, not because of Nazi ideology, but because the Red Army, which advances relentlessly, carries vivid memories of 1940, mass deportations, summary executions, and entire families sent to labor camps in Siberia. With every shot, every Estonian feels the weight of an impossible choice: fight under German command or face cultural and physical annihilation at the hands of the Soviets. Many have family members hiding in nearby villages, living in uncertainty as to whether the Soviets' return will bring a new wave of terror. For them, war is not a matter of victory or defeat. It is a matter of survival. On the battlefield, the crossfire is incessant. Soviet artillery hammers the trenches relentlessly, reducing defensive positions to smoking craters. On the other hand, German officers demand resistance at any cost, threatening to shoot those who retreat. Estonians are crushed between two giants, an enemy that advances relentlessly and a forced ally that brooks no hesitation. Some exhausted fighters engrave a single hope in their minds: to delay the Soviet advance long enough for their families to flee westward. Others fight as if every bullet is personal, as if by firing they are avenging years of humiliation and fear. In the whirlwind of snow, smoke and blood, no one can stop to think. Estonians reload their weapons, with trembling hands, savoring the bitter mixture of hatred and despair. They are soldiers, but above all, they are children of a land being torn apart. The defense of Narva, the frozen hell of February 1944. February 1944. The Russian winter, relentless and icy, tightened its deadly embrace on the Eastern Front. Amid the white, silent expanse of Estonia, a city was preparing to become the epicenter of one of the most brutal and forgotten battles of World War II, Narva. Once a picturesque medieval trading center with its cobblestone streets and Hanseatic architecture, Narva would become a slaughterhouse, a symbol of desperate resistance and incalculable sacrifice. The annihilation scenario, a city in flames and rubble. The fortress city, strategically positioned on the isthmus between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Peipus, was key to the Soviet advance toward East Prussia and Finland. For the Germans, it represented the last line of defense before the rearguard of Army Group North. Narva's vital importance made it a target for annihilation. Soviet artillery, with its overwhelming firepower, gave no respite. Waves of incessant bombardment, intensifying nightly, reduced entire neighborhoods to smoking piles of bricks and charred wood. The deafening sound of explosions was the constant soundtrack of death, punctuated by the dry crack of rifle fire and the roar of machine guns. The wooden houses, so common in local architecture, became fire traps. The smallest shard, the tiniest spark, transformed them into giant torches, illuminating the snow with an ominous orange glow that danced to the chaotic rhythm of the explosions. The dense, acrid smoke of gunpowder and burning wood hung over the city, mixing with the freezing, biting air. Breathing was a painful task, each breath a slash through the lungs, a constant reminder of the toxicity of war. Visibility was nearly nil, transforming the battlefield into a maze of shadows and hidden dangers, where death could arise from any direction. The desperate resistance, an amalgam of bravery and despair. Narva's defenders were a disparate force, but united by a common purpose: to halt the Soviet advance at any cost. Experienced German troops, hardened by years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front, formed the core of the defense. Alongside them, determined Estonians, many of them forcibly conscripted but fighting with almost animalistic ferocity for their homeland, transformed every street, every building into a makeshift fortress. The 20th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, 1st Estonian, composed of Estonian volunteers and conscripts, played a crucial role, fighting with a fervor bordering on fanaticism, aware that Soviet occupation would mean the end of their nation. Narva's narrow streets, once the hustle and bustle of markets and daily life, became death rows. Every building, even the most damaged, was a machine gun nest, its dark windows concealing snipers ready to reap lives. Every corner was a death trap, where grenades could rain down from collapsed rooftops or bursts of crossfire could sweep away any advance. Snipers, silent ghosts of war, hid in the bell towers and rubble, patiently waiting for the right moment to cut down Soviet officers, disrupting their attacks and undermining morale. Soviet assault groups, driven by the doctrine of Stalin's broad front and the need to break through the German line, they attempted to advance through the rubble. However, they encountered brutal and unexpected resistance. Grenades fell from the windows of ruined buildings, exploding among Soviet soldiers, and each block conquered was paid for with rivers of blood. The combat was hand-to-hand, savage and relentless, waged amidst a landscape of apocalyptic destruction. The Narva River, a frozen barrier and an icy tomb. The Narva River, which divided the city and served as a natural border, became a crucial element in the battle. By February, its waters had frozen, turning it into a treacherous and deadly surface. Soviet tanks, desperately trying to outflank the German and Estonian defenses, attempted to cross it. The ice, however, could not always support the colossal weight of these war machines. With a terrifying crack, the ice gave way, engulfing tanks and their crews in the icy, dark waters. The sound of the ice breaking, mixed with the desperate screams of the drowning men, added a layer of surreal horror to the carnage. Many Soviet soldiers who managed to cross were immediately met with devastating crossfire, turning the crossing into a death trap. The drama of civilians, between the crossfire and hopelessness. Trapped between the lines, the civilians of Narva lived a daily nightmare. The city, once home to a vibrant population, was now a living hell. Thousands of Estonians, many of them elderly, women and children, ran from shelter to shelter, seeking refuge from the relentless barrage of shells. They dragged with them what little they could carry, their faces etched with terror and exhaustion. The evacuation of the civilian population had been chaotic and incomplete, leaving many at the mercy of the brutality of war. The constant fear of being hit by a shell or caught in the crossfire was a palpable reality. Hunger and cold were constant companions, and hope for an end to the conflict seemed increasingly distant. Many civilians were killed or wounded, and those who survived would carry the physical and psychological scars of that hell for the rest of their lives. Unsung heroes and the ferocity of defense. Amid this indescribable chaos, unsung heroes emerged on both sides. Estonian soldiers, aware of Narva's strategic importance to their nation's survival, fought with a ferocity bordering on fanaticism. Even with no hope of ultimate victory, they were determined to turn Narva into a graveyard for every Soviet step, inflicting as many casualties as possible. Their resistance was an act of desperation and patriotism, a testament to human resilience in the face of extreme adversity. German troops, veterans of countless battles on the Eastern Front, erected lines of crossfire that made each enemy advance a journey through hell itself. They employed effective defensive tactics, taking advantage of urban terrain and ruins to create fortified positions. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and the few available armored vehicles was crucial to repel the waves of Soviet attacks. Each night, the Soviet attacks were renewed, with new troops and more artillery. And with each dawn, the scene of destruction revealed itself even more grim, with mountains of bodies mixed with the snow and rubble. Narva was resisting, but at the cost of becoming a sea of rubble, blood, and ghosts, a monument to the brutality of war and the indomitable will to survive. Relentless counterattacks, the dance of death in Narva. In February 1944, Narva was not just a besieged city. It was a bloody chessboard where every move was calculated in lives. The advantage, a fleeting phantom, never remained with one side for long. No sooner had the Soviet hordes, driven by Stalin's doctrine of relentless advance, managed to consolidate a street than the response came with calculated and brutal fury. The German and Estonian forces, aware that every meter yielded was a step toward annihilation, counterattacked under the protective cloak of darkness. The daytime battles of the Soviet advance transformed into a hellish cycle of advance and retreat at night, where every meter of ground was paid for with rivers of blood, sweat, and frozen tears. The night, the stage of urban brutality. Night counterattacks were the moment when the true, visceral brutality of urban warfare revealed itself in its most terrifying fullness. Under the flickering, ghostly light of distant artillery flashes and the flames consuming buildings, German assault groups, hardened veterans of countless campaigns on the Eastern Front, crawled through the rubble, armed with the trusty MP-40 machine gun, which spat fire with a deadly cadence, and hand grenades. They silently approached the newly conquered Soviet positions. The silence of the night, broken only by the icy wind and the groans of the wounded, was a palpable tension, a harbinger of the coming storm. As soon as the distance was sufficient for a devastating strike, the silence was shattered by a hellish cacophony. Grenades exploded in succession, sending deadly shrapnel and flames in all directions. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning flesh. Within seconds, the street the Soviets had conquered with such sacrifice became a slaughterhouse, a meat grinder where life was mercilessly reaped. The fighting was chaotic, brutal, fought amidst a lunar landscape of craters and ruins where death lurked in every shadow. Earth Guardians, Estonian rage. The Estonians, fighting for their own land and their very existence, were a force to be reckoned with. Knowing every alley, every secret passage, every shortcut, and every hiding place in the city that was their home, they led surprise attacks with unparalleled ferocity. They used the terrain to their advantage, transforming the ruins into a deadly labyrinth for the invaders. They ambushed Soviet T-34 tanks, the seemingly invincible steel giants, with a lethal mix of Molotov cocktails and magnetic charges. The crack of metal being torn apart by explosions echoed through the streets, a horrifying sound that heralded destruction. Muffled screams of the crew members trapped in the flames followed, a symphony of agony mingling with the roar of battle. The combat quickly degenerated into a primal, desperate hand-to-hand struggle. Bayonets dug into flesh, rifle butts crushed skulls, with a hollow, sickening sound. And even trench shovels, work tools, were transformed into improvised weapons, used with savage brutality. Blood, hot and viscous, mixed with snow, creating a scarlet, slippery mud under the combatants' feet. Many soldiers, too exhausted to think, fought on pure instinct, driven by the adrenaline pumping through their veins and the paralyzing fear of death that surrounded them on all sides. The line between humanity and bestiality blurred in the heat of battle, where survival was the only law. A cycle of blood and despair. Each Soviet attack was met with unwavering fury, an iron determination not to yield a single inch of ground. And each victory of the defenders, however heroic, was only temporary, a brief respite before the next storm. New enemy waves, seemingly inexhaustible, arrived at dawn, bringing with them more men, more tanks, more artillery, renewing the cycle of destruction. The streets of Narva became a land where no one could sleep. The sound of footsteps in the darkness could mean friendly reinforcements, the promise of momentary relief or imminent death coming to claim another life. And yet, the counterattacks continued, a testament to the resilience and desperation of the defenders. Every soldier knew deep down that if the city fell, there would be nowhere to retreat. Narva was the last bastion, the final line. The defense was not just a military tactic, it was a fight for existence itself, for the survival of a people and a nation. It was the embodiment of the maxim that in war, the only option is to fight to the last man, to the last bullet, to the last breath. And in Narva, this maxim lived every second, in every explosion, in every scream, in every drop of blood spilled on the snow. The air war, the burning sky of Narva. Above the earthly hell of Narva, where the ground trembled under the weight of artillery and the air filled with the smell of gunpowder and blood, the sky transformed into a second battlefield as relentless and deadly as what unfolded below. In February 1944, air supremacy was a coveted prize, and both the Luftwaffe and the Soviet Air Force fought ferociously to seize it, transforming the clouds into a stage for dogfights and devastating bombing raids. The Luftwaffe Hawks, terror of the skies. During the day, the piercing, unmistakable sound of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka's dive sirens cut through the frigid air, a harbinger of terror for the Soviet troops on the ground. These dive bombers, with their inverted gull-shaped wings and fearsome Jericho trumpet siren, were designed to instill panic and inflict precise destruction. They dove at near-vertical angles with a deafening roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the sky, dropping their bombs with terrifying precision on the Soviet columns, advancing across the icy roads and open fields. Each airstrike opened massive craters in the snowy landscape, scattering vehicle wreckage and mangled bodies across the pristine snow, which was quickly turning red. To the soldiers in the open, the Stuka was the embodiment of death from the skies, a relentless predator that left no chance of escape. But the Luftwaffe didn't rely solely on Stukas. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 patrolled the skies, seeking to intercept any Soviet aircraft that dared challenge their dominance. Although the Soviet Air Force's numerical superiority on the Eastern Front was overwhelming, the German pilots, many of them veterans with dozens of aerial victories, fought with remarkable skill and desperation, defending the airspace over Narva tooth and nail. The rise of the Soviet Air Force, red vengeance. However, German aerial dominance was far from assured. The Soviet Air Force, with its vast numerical superiority and the growing quality of its aircraft, posed a constant and increasingly lethal threat. Fighters like the agile Yakovlev Yak-9 and the robust Lavochkin La-5 appeared out of nowhere, attacking German bombers and engaging in deadly dogfights over the ruined city. The aerial combat was fast, frenetic, and relentless. Planes dove in desperate acrobatics, fired short, deadly bursts of machine gun and cannon, fire, and disappeared as quickly as they appeared, amidst snow-laden clouds and the thick smoke rising from the inferno below. When a fighter was hit, it spiraled downward, trailing black smoke and fire, transforming into an incandescent fireball that lit up the darkness of the night before exploding in a devastating impact upon impact, leaving only a smoking crater to bear witness to its demise. Soviet bombers, such as the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, known as the flying tank for its ruggedness, and ground attack capability, and medium-range bombers, such as the Petliakov P-2, launched waves of attacks on Narva. Their bombardments were merciless, reducing entire blocks of the city to smoking rubble. Each impact raised columns of dust, snow, and debris, dyed red by fire and blood, engulfing combatants and civilians indiscriminately. The explosions left the defenders stunned, deafened by the deafening noise, their ears ringing and their nostrils filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, burning metal, and sometimes charred flesh. The intensity of the Soviet bombings was such that, by March 1944, Narva was virtually razed to the ground, with over 90% of its buildings destroyed or damaged. The dread of heaven for those on earth. For the soldiers on the ground, the air war was as deadly and terrifying as what they faced in the trenches and on the streets. The constant threat of air raids loomed overhead, turning every moment outdoors into a calculated risk. The sound of aircraft became synonymous with dread. A distant drone in the sky made hearts race and bodies instinctively shrink, seeking any kind of cover, no matter how precarious. The feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming, as there was nowhere to run or hide when the bombs began to fall. Civilians, the most vulnerable in this apocalyptic scenario, hid in makeshift shelters, damp basements, building ruins, or any hole in the ground that might offer a modicum of protection, praying that the next bomb wouldn't fall on them. Many, unfortunately, weren't so lucky. Entire families disappeared in the blink of an eye as high-explosive bombs penetrated the fragile wooden walls of their houses, turning homes into instant tombs. Terror was constant, with every siren, every engine roar, every explosion that echoed through the city. Life in Narva was a macabre lottery, where survival was a matter of pure luck. With each passing day, the skies over Narva became a deadly game of Russian roulette, with neither force achieving ultimate supremacy. The Luftwaffe, though outnumbered, fought with the ferocity of those defending their last bastion. The Soviet Air Force, with its vast fleet, sought to crush German resistance and pave the way for the ground advance. While the skies thundered with the sound of engines, machine guns and explosions, on the ground, the battle raged on, increasingly bloody, ever closer to total collapse, a testament to the brutality of air and ground warfare merging into a single, terrifying spectacle of destruction. The Blue Line, the breaking point, Estonia's last cry of defiance. July 1944 arrived upon Narva not as a summer reprieve, but as a death sentence, a merciless verdict handed down by the gods of war. After months of unrelenting battle, of carnage that had transformed the once picturesque town into a smoking heap of rubble and nightmares, the German and Estonian defenders, exhausted to the limit of human endurance and decimated by incalculable losses, were forced to retreat to their last hope, their final refuge, the Tannenberg Line, known among them, with a mixture of reverence and despair as the Blue Line. It was not just a defensive line on the map, it was the backbone of the Estonian Wall, a complex system of hastily erected but ingeniously placed bunkers, anti-tank ditches that stretched for miles like open scars in the landscape, and an intricate web of trenches winding through dense forests and blood-soaked hills, each meter gained at an incalculable cost in life and sanity. The last wall, despair, determination, and the smell of death. For the remaining men, the survivors of a seemingly endless hell, the Blue Line was not merely a strategic position on a military map. It was the final wall, the ultimate barrier between Estonia and the abyss of Soviet occupation. Behind it, there was nothing but humiliating surrender or certain death. There was nowhere to retreat, no friendly land to flee to. Each soldier, with hands calloused from shoveling and eyes bloodshot with exhaustion and fear, dug into the frozen, soggy earth, transforming every square meter into a makeshift fortress, a redoubt of resistance forged in pain, sacrifice, and iron determination. The thick, sticky mud, mixed with the dried blood of fallen comrades and the grime of battle, clung to their torn uniforms, weighing them down like a shroud, a constant reminder of mortality. The smell of sweat, gunpowder, disturbed earth, and, inescapably, decaying bodies permeated the air, a fetid haze that reminded everyone that this was the end of the line, the point of no return. With each breath, the odor of death and hopelessness entered their lungs, a constant reminder of the brutal reality surrounding them, a reminder that life was a luxury few could afford. The Tannenberg Line defenses, though built under pressure and with limited resources, were formidable. The Sinimäed Heights, which gave the battle its name in Estonian, Sinimägide, Laihing, or Battle of the Blue Hills, offered a crucial topographical advantage. Three main hills, Lastekodumägi, Orphanage Hill, Grenaderimägi, Grenadier Hill, and Tornimägi, Tower Hill, each transformed into an impregnable fortress. The German and Estonian positions were linked by a network of tunnels and underground shelters, allowing the movement of troops and supplies under enemy fire and protecting them from the incessant bombardment. Heavy machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns were strategically positioned to create devastating crossfire zones, making any Soviet advance a suicide. The morale of the defenders, although shaken by exhaustion and losses, was sustained by the knowledge that they were fighting for their homeland, for their families, against an enemy that showed no mercy, an enemy that represented the annihilation of their culture and their freedom. The Red Storm gathers, the weight of inevitability and the Soviet war machine. On the other side of the line, the vast and relentless Red Army was preparing its final offensive. More than 136,000 soldiers, an overwhelming force supported by seemingly endless heavy artillery and hundreds of T-34 tanks, lined up to crush the last of the resistance. The Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming, a 4-to-1 ratio of men and equipment, a human and metal wave ready to sweep away everything in its path. Each dawn brought with it the growing roar of Soviet preparation, the roar of truck engines dropping, supplies and ammunition, the metallic clang of artillery pieces being deployed, the ominous sound of infantry columns surging from the horizon like an unstoppable red tide, a harbinger of destruction. The defenders, exhausted, hungry and frayed, felt the weight of inevitability approaching, a gigantic shadow stretching over them, threatening to swallow them whole. Soviet commanders, aware of the strategic importance of Narva and the Tannenberg Line for the continuation of their Baltic offensive and the eventual invasion of East Prussia, were determined to break through the defenses at any cost. Detailed plans were drawn up, involving coordinated infantry, armor, and artillery attacks, with massive air support. The Soviet doctrine of the deep offensive would be fully applied, seeking not only to break through the line, but also to exploit the gap with reserve forces to completely disorganize the enemy defense and turn the retreat into a rout. The pressure on the defenders was immense, not only physical, but also psychological. They knew they were alone, that there would be no significant reinforcements, and that the fate of Estonia rested on their weary shoulders, on their ability to withstand the final and most brutal assault. The silence before the storm, the night of trouble and the wait for the bloody dawn. At night, an unsettling silence fell over the blue line, a silence charged with tension and foreboding. It was a silence that amplified every sound, every whisper of the icy wind, every snap of a twig in the distant forest. Men smoked their last cigarettes, the glowing embers glowing like small eyes in the darkness, illuminating faces etched with fatigue and apprehension. Some wrote hurried letters, words of farewell and love that might never be delivered, destined to be lost in the chaos of war, to become just another fragment of a collective tragedy. The cold Baltic wind swept through the trenches, carrying with it the metallic smell of enemy tank fuel and the acrid odor of death that hung in the air, a constant suffocating presence. Every soldier knew deep down that the next attack would decide everything. That morning would bring the final confrontation, each man's personal Armageddon, the moment when life and death would meet in a brutal embrace. The night air was punctuated only by the distant sounds of Soviet activity, the creak of tank tracks moving into attack positions, the roar of truck engines carrying ammunition and supplies, the muffled commands of officers giving final instructions. The defenders at their posts watched the flickering lights on the horizon, knowing that each represented a growing threat, another step toward the inevitable. Insomnia was a constant companion, and sleep, when it came, was shallow and disturbed by nightmares of explosions and screams. Camaraderie, forged in the fires of battle, was the only thing that kept them sane, the only source of comfort amidst despair. They shared rations, cigarettes, and stories, trying to find a glimmer of humanity in a world that had become inhumane, a world where the only certainty was the uncertainty of the next hour. Hell breaks loose, the final battle, and the ultimate sacrifice. When the Soviet artillery finally opened fire, the entire world seemed to shatter. This was no ordinary bombardment. It was a barrage of apocalyptic proportions, a deluge of steel and fire that transformed the landscape into an indescribable inferno. Thousands of shells fell every minute, exploding with cataclysmic force, engulfing the trenches, disintegrating men and timber in a whirlwind of fire, twisted metal, and pulverized earth. The ground shook violently, the air becoming a dense mass of smoke, dust, and shrapnel. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that seemed to tear apart time and space itself, a sound that penetrated the bones and the soul. The shockwaves were so powerful they could rip out the lungs of men, even those sheltered in bunkers, leaving them breathless, speechless, with only terror in their eyes. And amidst this storm of steel and fire, the defenders, blinded by the smoke and deafened by the explosions, gripped their rifles, their bayonets ready, their hearts beating a frantic rhythm of defiance. They swore they would not retreat another step. The blue line, Estonia's last wall, would be defended to the last man, to the last bullet, to the last breath. The battle for the nation's survival had reached its climax, and the fate of thousands of lives would be decided on the blood-soaked hills of Sinimäed. It was a desperate struggle, a heroic resistance against all odds, a final sacrifice in the name of freedom, of the homeland, of the memory of their ancestors, and of the hope of a future. And as the explosions continued to rip through the air, the defenders of the Blue Line braced themselves for the inevitable, ready to face the storm raging around them with the courage of the desperate, the bravery of the doomed, the fury of those with nothing left to lose. The final assault, the Blue Line's cry of agony. On July 25, 1944, the oppressive silence that preceded the storm, a silence laden with foreboding and dread, was shattered by an uncontrollable fury, a deafening roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the universe. More than 136,000 Soviet soldiers, a seemingly endless tide of humanity, supported by thousands of artillery pieces spewing fire and steel and dozens of armored and relentless T-34 tanks, advanced in a massive coordinated assault against the Blue Line. Estonia's last desperate defense, the last bastion of a nation on the brink of the abyss. The sky, once grey and melancholy, filled with thick, dark smoke, while the ground, already battered by months of bombardment, shook violently, as if the earth itself were being ripped from its bowels, groaning under the weight of impending carnage. The deluge of fire, Soviet artillery, unleashes hell. The Soviet artillery, in a terrifying display of power and precision, unleashed a hellish bombardment, a deluge of fire and metal that transformed the trenches into smoking craters and the landscape into a lunar landscape of destruction. These were not isolated explosions, they were detonations in a series. A macabre symphony of destruction that hurled debris, earth, snow, and bodies into the air in a grotesque and deadly dance. The deafening sound of the artillery, a continuous thunder that seemed never to cease, was accompanied by the shrill, desperate screams of wounded and dying men, their wails echoing across the devastated landscape, mingling with the roar of the explosions and the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning flesh. Each impact was a blow to the defenders' hearts, a brutal reminder of the approaching inevitability. The shells of all calibers fell like a rain of death, pulverizing bunkers, disintegrating shelters, and turning any point of resistance to dust. The smoke and dust were so dense that visibility was almost nil, creating a suffocating fog where death lurked in every shadow. The defenders, stunned and deafened, clung to their positions, their bodies trembling from the shockwaves, their minds struggling to process the horror unfolding around them. Many were buried alive, others disintegrated in an instant, without even a chance to scream. The Blue Line, built with so much effort and hope, was being dismantled piece by piece under the crushing weight of Soviet artillery. The human avalanche. Hand-to-hand combat and blood-stained snow. When the bombardment finally ceased, leaving behind a momentary and terrifying silence, a human avalanche burst from the Soviet lines. Infantry, in successive waves, advanced between the tanks, machine guns drawn and bayonets fixed, hurling themselves against the German and Estonian bunkers and trenches. The fighting became fierce, brutal, and desperate. Rifle fire, machine gun bursts, the metallic clang of clashing bayonets, punches, stabs, the hollow sound of rifle butts crushing skulls. Everything blended into a primordial war of survival where civility was a forgotten luxury. The snow, once pure white, now red and stained with the blood of the combatants, darkened under the weight of the carnage, turning into a viscous purple mud, a silent testament to unspeakable violence. The defenders, tired, hungry, wounded and outnumbered, refused to give in. Every bunker, every trench, every inch of ground was fought over with almost animal ferocity, a desperation born of the certainty that there was nowhere to go. Men fired until their bullets ran out, then fought with knives, trench shovels and fists, turning their bodies into weapons. The smell of gunpowder, blood and burning flesh filled the air, while grenade and mortar explosions leveled the last strongholds of resistance, turning them into makeshift tombs. Courage was palpable, but hope, a luxury few could afford, was beginning to fade. The breaking point, the relentless. Fall, but the pressure was crushing, relentless. The German and Estonian lines, stretched to their limits, began to crack. Gaps appeared in the defenses, and the Soviet advance gained ground inch by inch, driven by numerical superiority and the determination to crush resistance. The fighting, intense and bloody, was a cruel game of life and death, where only one side would emerge victorious. The defenders, though fighting with superhuman bravery, were being slowly but inexorably crushed by the Soviet war machine. The roar of Soviet tanks, now breaking through the defenses and advancing on enemy positions, was the sound of approaching defeat. The coordination between Soviet infantry and armor was lethal, and the defenders, without significant air or armor support, were swept away. Estonia was about to be taken, its fate sealed in the Sinimäed hills, but not without leaving a trail of courage, sacrifice and resistance that would echo forever in history, a testament to a people's desperate struggle for their freedom and their land. The blue line had been breached, but the memory of its heroic defense would remain, a somber and inspiring reminder of human brutality and resilience in the face of total war. Hand-to-hand hell, the bestiality of fighting in Narva, as the defenses of the Blue Line, the last bastion of Estonian hope, began to crumble under the crushing weight of the Soviet assault. The battle quickly devolved into a visceral, indescribable nightmare. The battlefield, once dominated by the roar of artillery and the dry crack of rifles, gave way to a more intimate and terrifying cacophony. The clang of clashing metal, the wet sound of ripping flesh, and the muffled screams of pain, fury, and despair. In the cramped trenches, in the claustrophobic bunkers, and among the rubble of the city, the fighting degenerated into a bloody, brutal, dirty, and merciless hand-to-hand fight, where the line between man and beast was completely blurred. The primal struggle, every inch a life. The soldiers, both defenders and attackers, had no room to retreat. Trapped, exhausted, and with adrenaline pumping, every inch of ground was fought for with primal ferocity. Bayonets, sharp and bloodthirsty, dug into flesh with a repulsive sound. Rifle butts transformed into makeshift hammers, crushed skulls with a hollow, sickening impact. Knives, wielded with desperate precision, tore through uniforms and skin, opening deep, lethal wounds. The sound of bodies, falling ribs breaking under the weight of a blow, and blood gushing in hot jets mingled with the roar of nearby explosions, creating a symphony of horror that echoed across the devastated landscape. Hands, trembling and covered in frozen mud and congealed blood, clutched at anything that could be used as a weapon. Wounded men, without ammunition and without hope of reinforcements, fought desperately for survival, driven by a basic instinct for self-preservation. The fight was a tangle of bodies, where the enemy's identity was lost in the fury of the moment. There was no honor, only the need to kill or be killed. Eyes, wide with terror and exhaustion, reflected the brutality of the scene, while the smell of sweat, fear, and death became unbearable. The horror scene, between the mud and the fire. In this hellish landscape, death came in every form. Some fighters were crushed under the tracks of Soviet tanks, which mercilessly advanced on the trenches, turning men into a shapeless mass. Others were swallowed by the craters opened by artillery, falling into deep, muddy holes where darkness and terror consumed them. Those who managed to remain standing, even wounded, clung in a last act of desperation, tearing the lives of their enemies with tooth and nail in a savage and inhuman struggle. The air was saturated with the intense smell of iron, blood, and burning flesh, a nauseating mixture that clung to the nostrils and throat. The relentless cold of the Estonian winter spared no one, mixing with the sweat and blood of a relentless struggle, freezing the limbs and numbing the senses. In this scenario of chaos and despair, war ceased to be a strategic matter of troop movements and tactical objectives, and became a primal, existential matter, surviving the next moment. Men fought to exhaustion, to their last breath, until their bodies could no longer move, knowing that their downfall meant not only the loss of their own lives, but also the definitive loss of Estonia and the end of all hope. It was a fight for the soul of a nation, fought meter by meter, hand to hand, in a frozen hell where humanity was tested to its most extreme limits. The impending collapse, the twilight of the resistance in Narva. Despite the defenders' almost superhuman courage, the resilience forged in the fire and blood of months of combat, the Soviet pressure finally became unbearable. It was a relentless tide, a crushing force that, inch by inch, meter by meter, eroded their resolve and resilience. The lines that had once formed an impenetrable wall, the Blue Line, the last bastion of Estonian hope, began to give way, to crack under the weight of the relentless assault. The trenches, once safe havens, became isolated holes, death traps, surrounded by enemies who advanced relentlessly like ravenous wolves on their prey. The sound of explosions, which had once dominated the battlefield, could no longer mask the screams of surrounded men, fighting to the last moment, to their last breath, to avoid capture or death, preferring an honorable death to surrender. The desperation of the defenders, the end of the line. The German officers, their uniforms soiled and their faces etched with fatigue and despair, struggled to maintain discipline, but the task was Herculean. Morale, already shattered, crumbled with each new wave of attack. Many soldiers were wounded, some seriously, with limbs torn and bodies shaking with exhaustion. Ammunition, a precious and increasingly scarce resource, was running low, and hunger and cold were eroding the last of their physical and mental strength. Orders to retreat, when they finally arrived, came too late for hundreds, perhaps thousands of men trapped in encircled pockets, islands of resistance in a sea of enemies. They faced constant attacks from machine guns, grenades, and tanks, a hopeless struggle against a numerically superior and implacable enemy. Amid the frozen mud, congealed blood, and smoking wreckage, hope faded. Like the smoke that still hung over the battlefield, a grey shroud over shattered dreams. The wounded, left to their own devices or dragged to makeshift shelters, moaned in pain, their cries mingling with the macabre chorus of battle. The medics, exhausted and short of supplies, did what they could, but the scale of the carnage was overwhelming. With every minute, more men fell, and the Blue Line, which had held out for so long, now disintegrated into fragments, each fighting its own final battle. Communication was nearly impossible, and chaos reigned, turning the retreat into a desperate flight, with each man fighting for himself, for his own survival. The Estonians' grief, fear of the future. Estonian civilians and soldiers who, miraculously, managed to escape the hell of Narva and the Blue Line, watched with grief and a profound sense of loss as the defenses they had defended with such fury and sacrifice collapsed. For them, the fall of Narva was not just a military defeat. It was the loss of their homeland, the subjugation of their people. The fear of what would come with the Soviet advance was palpable, a cold shadow stretching over their souls. For them, there was no victory, only the struggle to survive the consequences of a war that was not theirs, but that had consumed them completely. The memory of Soviet atrocities during the first occupation was still fresh, and the fear of a new regime of terror was an imminent reality. Estonian families, separated and scattered, faced an uncertain future. Many attempted to flee westward to Sweden or Germany, seeking refuge from the Soviet fury. Others, trapped in their homes or in makeshift shelters, awaited the inevitable, their hearts heavy with grief and uncertainty. The landscape, once vibrant and full of life, was now a wasteland of ruins, a silent testament to the brutality of war and the sacrifice of a people. The end of the wall, Narva falls. The wall of Estonia was cracking, the fissures widening. By the minute, the Red Army advanced relentlessly, with seemingly endless force. Narva, the fortress city that had held out for months, began to fall to the enemy, leaving a trail of destruction and death that would forever mark the history of that bloody winter. The streets, once the scene of fierce fighting, were now filled with Soviet soldiers who hoisted their flags over the rubble, proclaiming victory. Smoke still hung over the city, mingling with the smell of gunpowder and the odor of death, while the silence that followed the battle was more terrifying than the fighting itself. It was the silence of defeat, the silence of occupation, the silence of a nation that had fought bravely but ultimately succumbed to the overwhelming force of the enemy. The fall of Narva was a grim milestone, a brutal reminder of the cost of war and the fragility of freedom. Retreat and scorched earth, the scar left in Narva, with the Blue Line, the last bastion of resistance in Narva, finally breached under the crushing weight of the Soviet assault. The German command, aware of the inevitability of defeat and seeking to avoid the total annihilation of its forces, ordered a strategic withdrawal. But this was no ordinary retreat. It was one marked by fire, devastation, and calculated cruelty. As the troops retreated south, leaving behind the hell of Narva, they took with them not only wounded soldiers and the last of their equipment, but also a cruel and relentless plan to leave nothing, absolutely nothing, that could be of any use to the pursuing enemy. The march of destruction, the path of fire. The trail of the German retreat was a scene of desolation and ruin. Roads, once vital for transporting troops and supplies, were systematically destroyed, transformed into impassable trails riddled with craters and obstacles. Bridges, which had served as arteries for movement, were set ablaze, their wooden and metal structures twisted into smoking skeletons that collapsed into rivers and valleys. Supply depots, which could have fed and equipped the Soviet advance, were blown up in a dense cloud of black smoke and soot, which mixed with the biting Baltic cold, creating an apocalyptic landscape. Each step back was a desperate attempt to delay the Soviet advance, to gain precious time, turning the territory into an inhospitable maze of ruins, deadly obstacles, and hidden traps. The land, once fertile and inhabited, was now a minefield of destruction, where every shadow seemed to hide a danger. The German demolition teams worked tirelessly, with cold, methodical efficiency. Landmines were planted at strategic points, booby traps were left in abandoned buildings, and every water well was contaminated, rendering it useless. The idea was to turn the Red Army's path into a logistical hell, forcing them to waste precious time and resources overcoming the obstacles they had created. The sound of distant explosions, the smell of smoke, and the glow of flames on the horizon were the retreating troops' only companions, a constant reminder of the destruction they were leaving behind. The scorched earth, the sacrifice of the earth itself. The villages and hamlets around Narva, which had survived the initial bombardments, did not escape the terror of the scorched earth strategy. Homes, barns, schools, and even churches were set ablaze in a devastating fury. Crops that could have fed the population and enemy troops were destroyed, and livestock was slaughtered or driven away, denying the enemy any resources. It was a brutal tactic, a cold and calculated decision to deny resources and shelter to the enemy, even if it meant sacrificing the very land they had sworn to protect. the land that was home to thousands of innocent civilians. Civilians, many of them elderly, women and children, watched helplessly as all that remained was consumed by the fire, the crackling sound of the flames echoing like a lament for lost freedom, for lives disintegrating before their eyes. The despair was palpable, the pain visible on their faces, streaked with smoke and tears. For the soldiers, the retreat was bitter. They left behind dead and wounded comrades, whose bodies lay in the snow, silent witnesses to a lost battle. The march was exhausting, through heavy snow and frozen mud, with the biting Baltic wind whipping their faces. Their spirits were broken, the fatigue was overwhelming, but the will to resist persisted, even amid destruction and hopelessness. They knew the next confrontation was inevitable, that the fight was not over, only a change of scenery. With each step, the sense of defeat deepened, but so did the determination to fight to the end, to make the enemy pay a heavy price for every meter gained. The legacy of Narva, a monument of ruins. Narva, the fortress city that had held out for months, that had become a symbol of resistance and sacrifice, was now reduced to a field of smoldering rubble. What had once been bustling streets and historic buildings were now just piles of bricks, charred wood, and twisted metal. It was a grim monument to the bloody struggle that marked Estonia's cruelest winter, a grim reminder of the cost of war and the fragility of civilization. Smoke still rose from the ruins, mingling with the smell of gunpowder and the odor of death, while the silence that followed the battle was more terrifying than the fighting itself. It was the silence of defeat, the silence of occupation, the silence of a nation that had fought bravely but ultimately succumbed to the enemy's overwhelming strength. The fall of Narva was a grim milestone, a brutal reminder of the cost of war and the fragility of freedom, an indelible scar on the history of Estonia and World War II. When Soviet forces finally enter Narva, the victory is bittersweet and marked by a heavy silence. The city that once throbbed with life is now a vast graveyard of rubble, where the smell of smoke, blood, and death still permeates the frozen air. The Soviets paid a terrible price. Tens of thousands of dead and wounded lie scattered throughout the streets and trenches, victims of the fierce resistance they encountered. For Soviet soldiers, the victory was a mixture of relief and horror. Many lost friends and brothers in arms in brutal combat, witnessing scenes of carnage no training could prepare them for. The war, which for them was a patriotic duty, turned out to be a macabre dance between life and death. For Estonians, the Soviet victory signifies the return of a sinister shadow. Hope for freedom has been crushed under the red boots, and the fear of deportations, arrests, and repressions haunts the people once again. Those who resisted know that the real battle is yet to come, the struggle to preserve their identity and survive under a ruthless regime. Narva, the Estonian wall, became a symbol of desperate resistance and the tragedy that accompanies war. Its fall was not just the loss of a city, but the harbinger of dark years for a people who had fought to their last breath. The Battle of Narva has gone down in history as one of the bloodiest and most desperate episodes of World War II on the Eastern Front. The Estonian Wall was not just a line of defense. It was a symbol of the resilience of a people caught between two giants, fighting for the survival of their land, their culture, and their hope. Though the Soviet advance was inevitable, the fury with which the defenders resisted forever marked the Estonian spirit. German and Estonian soldiers, united by fear and determination, transformed a frozen landscape into a field of blood and courage, proving that even overwhelming forces can be stopped, if only for a short time. Decades later, those events are remembered not only through numbers and maps, but through human stories of the young men who braved cold and death, of the civilians who endured unimaginable horrors, and of the families torn apart by war. The wall may have fallen, but the legacy of courage and resistance lives on in Estonia's memories and identity. Narva isn't just a name in history books, it's a rallying cry, a testament to the price of freedom and a grim reminder of what happens when the world is consumed by war.